Yo, what's up? Welcome back to another episode of the SWUS College Football Week 10. Saturday's here. My streak is in jeopardy. My streak of 3 straight winning weeks. I lost on Tuesday and lost on Wednesday. So I'm coming into Saturday down money. Now, there's plenty of action on the board. I could still get into the green, but definitely starting from behind here. So yeah, going to get to as many games as I can. Probably not going to get to them all. But whatever I don't get to, we'll go through on the live show. 10 a.m. Eastern time. We'll be live for 2 straight hours, going through the entire slate, or at least as many games as we can. So if you're able to make it to the live show, we'd love to see you in the comments. College Football Saturday, Week 10. Let's do it.
Welcome to the SWUS. The SWUS. SWUS. Hey, get the SWUS.
We got a Service Academy game here. Air Force on the road at Army, and this is a true road game. This game's in West Point. It's not at a neutral site. Army laying 22 or 22.5, depending on your sports book. Total sitting at about 41.5 for this one. Let's take a look at the pie charts, and according to the data, action's coming in pretty heavily on the Army side. Over 80% of the tickets, over 90% of the money coming in on Army. Take it with a grain of salt. So let's go through this matchup quickly. I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about this one. You might be wondering how this line's only 22 based on what we've seen so far this year. If you look at Army defensively, significant edge here over the Air Force offense. Air Force offensively has been so terrible. One of the worst offenses in the country. 125th in yards per play, 127th in success rate. Yes, Army has played a questionable schedule, but still, they're taking care of business. 12th in yards per play, 4th in yards per carry, 16th in yards per pass attempt against their bad schedule. And then you flip it over to the other side of the ball, and it's not even a discussion. Army's had arguably the most explosive offense in college football so far this year. 2nd in yards per play, 1st in success rate, 2nd in yards per carry, 1st in success rate per rush, 1st in yards per pass attempt, 13th in success rate per drop back. Obviously, we know they're not doing a ton of passing, but when they have dropped back, it's been very successful against an Air Force defense that has been pretty terrible. I mean, 117th in yards per play. So how is this number only 22 and being bet down when Army's at home, a true home game for Army? Well, that's simply because of the type of game we're expecting to see here. I mean, the clock's never going to stop in this game. Air Force, 3rd in rushing frequency, 72nd in pace. So that's actually not bad pace-wise. Look at Army. 1st in run frequency, 122nd in pace. So neither of these teams run a particularly fast pace. They're going to be running the shit out of the ball. The clock is literally never going to stop. How many possessions are we expecting these teams to have in this game? I mean, 6 each? Kind of tough to be laying 3 touchdowns in a game where you might only get 6 or 7 possessions. So that's why money's coming in on the Air Force side. I do understand it. Am I actually going to bet Air Force? Probably not, but it would only, as long as it's above 3 touchdowns, it would only be Air Force plus the points, strictly because this clock's never going to stop. 6-7 possessions each in this one. So Air Force or pass. Next, Duke on the road at Miami. Canes are laying 20.5 points at home here. Total sitting at 54.5. Let's take a look at the pie charts, and according to the data, action's coming in heavily on the Duke side. 85% of the tickets, over 80% of the money. As I always say, take this data with a grain of salt. So let's get into this one, and we'll start with the matchup for Duke offensively. And to put it delicately, this is not a good one for Duke. Duke's offense hasn't been particularly good this year. 98th in yards per play, 109th in success rate, but specifically, they're very reliant on Malik Murphy throwing the ball. They don't have much of a rushing attack, and that's a problem when you're playing Miami. On the season, Duke is 98th in yards per carry, 127th in success rate per rush. As I mentioned, Duke offensively very reliant on Malik Murphy throwing the ball. He's got almost 1,800 yards, 6.4 yards per attempt, 17 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. He hasn't been bad, but it's pretty simple. You put pressure on him, you can beat him. You give him a clean pocket, he can beat you. The reason I said this looks like a bad matchup for Duke offensively is the dent in Miami's armor. I guess that's the phrase I'll use. The dent in Miami's armor defensively has been the run game. In their last 4 games, they actually have been run on. They're allowing 4.89 yards per carry, 41.2% success rate per rush, 129.5 rushing yards per game. So you can run on this Miami defensive front. But I mean, look at the opponents. Virginia Tech, Cal, Louisville, Florida State. Florida State maybe doesn't belong in there, but Duke isn't running the ball at all. In their last 3 games, they're averaging 3.36 yards per carry as a team, 94 rushing yards per game, 35% success rate per rush. Duke is actually one of the worst offensive lines in the country in terms of creating space in the run game. 127th in line yards, 128th in stuff rate. And if you're thinking, well, Kyle, I don't care about the run game. Malik Murphy's going to make throws. This Miami defense has shown us they give up big plays through the air. Okay, maybe, but Duke hasn't even been that efficient throwing the ball either. In their last 4 games, now that they're seeing some tougher defenses, just 194.8 passing yards per game, 35.5% success rate per dropback, just 5.43 yards per pass attempt. Like I mentioned, if you're able to get pressure on Malik Murphy, you can shut this entire Duke offense down. Miami most definitely has a pass rush. Now, on the other side of the ball, you can make a case for Duke's defense. They've actually been very good defensively this year. They're 23rd in DFEI, 15th in yards per play, 28th in success rate. Numbers against the pass look very good. 5th in yards per pass attempt, 16th in success rate, 22nd in effective pass. I question them a bit based on the fact that they haven't seen a ton of quarterbacks. They haven't seen a ton of passing attacks this year. Now they're going on the road to see probably the most dangerous passing attack in college football. I mean, the Miami offense is 1st in yards per play, 4th in success rate. They're actually running the ball now. The run game's been there. Look at the passing numbers. 5th in yards per pass attempt, 7th in success rate per dropback, 2nd in effective pass. Cam Ward having a Heisman Trophy season, over 2,700 yards, 9.8 yards per attempt, 24 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. Now, we did see Miami's offense struggle a bit last game against Florida State, just 215 passing yards in the game, 6 yards per attempt, 35.9% success rate per dropback. So Florida State was able to slow this passing offense down, but the truth is nobody else was. In the first 7 games, over 388 passing yards per game, 10.3 yards per pass attempt. So I personally would chalk that Florida State game up to be more of an outlier. I mean, Florida State's better defensively than you think, so you might be looking at that game saying, hey, Florida State's defense is good. Now they're playing another good defense in Duke. I don't absolutely hate that logic, and the truth is Duke has been great against the pass. 153.9 yards per game. This is in their first 7 games. 35.5% success rate per dropback, 4.83 yards per pass attempt. But last week against SMU, when they finally saw a dangerous offense, again, Duke hasn't seen a ton of great offenses this year. In that game against SMU, they got cooked. 10.8 yards per pass attempt in that game. Now, 34.8% success rate per dropback indicates they hit some big plays and they weren't consistently throwing the ball on Duke. But still, this is Miami in Miami. I don't really trust it. I could see how maybe you could get to Duke. I mean, they played really good defense. Miami's been running the ball. I don't know if that's going to be there. 5.7 yards per carry on the season, over 55% success rate per rush against a Duke defense that's allowing less than 3.9 yards per carry on the year, 40% success rate per rush. So I guess I could see it a little bit, but the truth is, I don't know how Duke's going to score points here on the road. We saw the Florida State defense come into Miami and give the offense problems. We saw it. Miami still covered the number. So I think the way I want to do it, instead of laying that big number with Miami, maybe Duke's defense is able to give Miami problems. I don't trust the Duke offense to get up and down the field. So give me Duke team total under 16.5. You can get it at plus 100. So Duke team total under here. Next, Stanford on the road at NC State. Wolfpack now laying 10 points at home. This number wasn't at 9.5. It's moved up to 10. Total sitting at 46.5. Take a look at the pie charts, and according to the data, action seems to be coming in pretty heavily on the NC State side. Over 65% of the tickets, over 60% of the money. Take this data with a grain of salt. So let's get into this matchup. And you might be looking at this one wondering how NC State is laying 10 points. If you look at the overall numbers on the year, I mean, this is a pretty close matchup. NC State's offense against Stanford's defense, actually, season-long numbers, Stanford's defense has been better. Just 103rd in yards per play, but they've been solid against the run. They've struggled against the pass, which is NC State's strength right now, so maybe that explains it, a mismatch. But the most likely reason for this number being all the way up at 10 is CJ Bailey seems to be developing into a really good quarterback in front of our eyes. Last 2 games for NC State, over 331 passing yards per game, over 46% success rate per dropback, 11.35 yards per pass attempt. I will say I'm a little worried that one of those games was against Syracuse. That defense is bad, especially against the pass. Cal's a solid opponent, though. So CJ Bailey definitely looking a lot better as of late, and they're matched up against a Stanford defense that can't seem to stop anybody through the air. In their last 6 games, they're allowing over 268 passing yards per game, 43.9% success rate per dropback. Actually, that's not too bad. 9.37 yards per pass attempt. So Stanford really struggling to stop the pass. CJ Bailey seems to be coming along fine. So Stanford really struggling to stop the pass against CJ Bailey and Concepcion and an NC State passing offense that seems to be figuring it out. So that's probably the best explanation for the 10-point line there. I will say, look at Stanford's last 6 opponents. Syracuse, okay, not a good football team, but McCord in the passing attack, we know that's formidable. Clemson, arguably one of the best offenses in college football. Virginia Tech, high-powered offense. Notre Dame, not the best passing offense, but obviously a very good football team. SMU, electric offense, and then Wake. Okay, we can definitely criticize them for Wake Forest, but the point I'm making is Stanford's played a much stronger schedule than NC State has recently. In my opinion, betting this game comes down to, are you a believer in what CJ Bailey's doing? He back-to-back good games. Do you think this North Carolina State team is at a point where you should be laying 10 points in a conference game? I think it's a good question. Should be a favorable matchup for him. 10 points is kind of a lot. But let's look at the other side. We got Stanford's offense against NC State's defense. Looks to be a significant advantage for NC State here. 56th in DFEI against Stanford, 110th in OFEI. Stanford 131st in yards per play, 133rd in yards per pass attempt. Thing is, Stanford's offensive numbers need to be taken with a bit of a grain of salt. Look who they've played. In their last 5 games, yeah, they're only averaging 12.4 yards per points per game, 4.14 yards per play. Terrible offensive numbers in their last 5 games. Look who they played. Clemson, Virginia Tech, Notre Dame, SMU, and then Wake. And you might be like, well, Kyle, Wake's in there. Well, actually, the offense didn't look bad against Wake Forest. They actually had a success rate above 54%. They covered. I had Stanford plus 3.5. I won this bet. Scored 24 points in the game. So Stanford's offense went through the gauntlet of tough opponents. Not to mention Ashton Daniels missed a game or 2 in there. He was banged up. He seems to be back. Played well against Wake Forest. So it might be a little bit of a buy low spot on a Stanford offense that we know isn't this bad. Now, we do have to give some credit to NC State's defense, though. Playing well in their last 4 games. 24.5 points allowed per game. 41.4% success rate. That's not great, but it's not bad. 4.99 yards per play. So they have been playing better defense as of late. NIU, Cal's offense doesn't even look the same. Syracuse, okay, that's a good passing offense, and Wake Forest. So again, the strength of schedule for NC State recently isn't even close to the teams that Stanford's been playing. So in my opinion, although NC State, I like what I'm seeing. If you're an NC State fan, you got to be pumped for the future. 10 points after playing a little bit of an easy schedule against a Stanford team that's been through the gauntlet. As long as there's not a major injury on Stanford that I'm missing, I couldn't find any. I'm going to be on Stanford here. Stanford plus 10 next game. Minnesota on the road at Illinois. Illini catching a full 3 at home in this one. Total sitting at 45.5. Let's take a look at the pie charts, and according to the data, action seems to be coming in on the Illinois side. About 75% of the tickets and about 55% of the money. As always, take this data with a grain of salt. So let's get into this one, and we'll start with the Minnesota offense. This new look Minnesota offense led by Max Brosmer. All of a sudden, Minnesota has a passing attack. On the season, they're 76th in yards per pass attempt, 21st in success rate per dropback, 23rd in effective pass. Sharp College Football has Minnesota as a top 25 passing attack, and after seeing some of the recent games, I do understand it. Minnesota as a whole, 51st in OFEI, struggling to run the ball this year, which is usually not what we've grown accustomed to when it comes to the Minnesota offense under PJ Fleck. Run game hasn't really been there. But they're on the road against an Illinois defense that is struggling. 79th in yards per play, 123rd in success rate. Struggling more so against the run than the pass, which I guess isn't the greatest matchup for Minnesota because, as I just said, Minnesota's struggling to run the ball this year. But does it matter? Because PJ Fleck has made it very clear what he wants to do this year. They're throwing the football. They're 32nd in pass frequency this year. Haven't seen numbers like this from Minnesota since the Tanner Morgan days back with, who were the receivers? Bateman was there. Tyler Johnson, I think, was the other one. Back in those Tanner Morgan Minnesota days. That had to be 3-4 years ago. So Minnesota passing offense now, led by FCS transfer Max Brosmer, over 1,700 yards passing, 7.1 yards per pass attempt, 12 touchdowns, 4 interceptions, A+ turnover-worthy play rate. Maybe doesn't make a ton of big downfield explosive plays through the air, but he protects the ball, which is something you love to see. Now, if you like Illinois here, you can point at the fact that Max Brosmer has struggled when pressured. A+ turnover-worthy play rate, so he doesn't turn the ball over, but doesn't get the ball downfield and takes a lot of sacks. D+ pressure to sack rate, D+ yards per pass attempt. Illinois, not the greatest defense, but they can pressure the passer. That is probably the strength of their defense. So there's something if you like Illinois, but we got to give the Gophers some credit. In the last 4 games, Minnesota's averaging 235 passing yards per game, over 49% success rate per dropback, just 7.5 yards per pass attempt. Like I said, not a ton of downfield explosive passes, but in terms of efficiency, Brosmer is making the throws. Now, another angle, if you like Illinois here, no question, Brosmer has looked a lot better in his home games than his road games recently. In his last 2 home games, over 244 passing yards per game, 63.5% success rate per dropback is silly, over 9.1 yards per attempt. Look at the passing numbers in their last 2 road games. Just 225.5 passing yards per game, success rate per dropback below 40%. Below 40% is not good. 5.85 yards per pass attempt. So as good as Brosmer's been recently, he's done that damage at home at Minnesota. This game is obviously on the road, but the good news for Minnesota is they're on the road at Illinois. And like I said before, Illinois defensively not playing their best football right now. In their last 4 games, they're allowing 28.8 points per game. 55.4% success rate is bad. 6.9 yards per play. They've been struggling on the defensive side of the ball. That being said, if you look at their opponents, Penn State, Oregon, Michigan, not the best offense, and Purdue. Purdue put up a big number on them. That's the game where that's just inexcusable. Getting lit up by Penn State and Oregon, okay, that's not really that bad. But look specifically at the Purdue game, and this is a little bit concerning. It's their last home game was against Purdue. 297 yards through the air allowed against Purdue. 48.1% success rate per dropback. 11.4 yards per pass attempt. By the way, they're also struggling against the run. In their last 4 games, over 205 rushing yards allowed per game, 60.9% success rate per rush, 5.41 yards per carry allowed. So they're struggling against the run as well. Good news for Illinois here is if you look at their opponents, Penn State, Oregon, Michigan can run the ball. Their offense isn't good as a whole, but they can run the ball. Purdue, okay. But they played 3 really dominant rushing attacks. Minnesota hasn't been running the ball well this year. 45.6% success rate per rush is okay, but no explosive plays on the ground. They're averaging 3.57 yards per carry as a team this year, under 108 rushing yards per game. So the fact that those Illinois bad defensive numbers against the run came at the hands of some really elite rushing offenses, I think it might be a little bit of a buy low for Illinois' defensive front. Keep in mind, this is an Illinois defensive front that went on the road and shut Nebraska down on the ground. Raiola was able to make some plays, but shut the Nebraska run game down. So we know the Illinois run defense isn't that bad. I truly think it's a buy low spot on the Illinois defense as a whole, but it's tough to doubt Brosmer, especially when we saw what Purdue did to Illinois. So I don't hate the matchup for Illinois' defense, but if you're on Minnesota, I do understand. But what about the other side? We got the Illini offense against Minnesota's defense, and this is an interesting one. So Illinois, as we know, been a pretty one-dimensional offense this year. They need to throw the ball with Altmaier, although in their last couple games they've been running it. We'll get to it in a second. But on the season, 48th in yards per pass attempt, 48th in success rate per dropback, 50th in effective pass, matched up against a Minnesota defense that has excellent numbers through the air. 13th in yards per pass attempt, 61st in success rate per dropback, 18th in effective pass. Minnesota defensively sitting at 23rd in DFEI. Now, I know a lot of people have bailed on the Illinois offense, just averaging 15 points per game in their last 2. They played Michigan and Oregon, just 4.52 yards per play. Maybe we cut them a little bit of a slack. I mean, 42.4% success rate isn't even bad, but no question, coming off back-to-back bad offensive performances, and the reason for that was the passing attack just wasn't there for Altmaier. In their last 2 games, just 120.5 passing yards per game, 33.9% success rate per dropback, 4.4 yards per pass attempt. They were running the ball actually pretty efficiently in the Michigan and Oregon game, 50% success rate per rush, over 4.5 yards per carry, but we know what this Illinois offense is. They need to throw the ball. In their first 6 games, they were averaging over 242 passing yards per game, 49.4% success rate per dropback, 8.47 yards per pass attempt. So I expect Illinois to get back to their roots, start throwing the ball again. Keep in mind, their last 2 games were against Michigan and Oregon. Minnesota's defense has been good, but they're not on Michigan or Oregon's level defensively. And speaking of the Minnesota defense, I mentioned before that they've got elite numbers against the pass, right? Well, when you take a closer look, it might be time to sell high on the Minnesota pass defense. In their first 5 games, they were allowing less than 97 passing yards per game. Less than 97 passing yards per game. 30.8% success rate per dropback, 4.36 yards per pass attempt. Elite numbers against the pass. Against who? North Carolina, Max Johnson got hurt, I believe, in the first quarter. An FCS program. Nevada, Iowa. Oh, that's a real electric passing attack. And Michigan. They didn't play a single team that can throw the ball in their first 5 games, and they racked up elite numbers against the pass. In their last 3 games, they're playing some teams that actually have quarterbacks. We're seeing the pass defense numbers balance out, come back down to earth, allowing 272 passing yards per game, 48.8 percent success rate per dropback. So teams have had success throwing the ball in Minnesota lately, and it actually gets worse than that. Take out USC and just look at their last 2 games, it seems to be getting worse. In their last 2 games against UCLA and Maryland, 308 passing yards allowed per game, 7.8 yards per attempt, 47.8% success rate per dropback. So I know when you look at the full season numbers, it looks like Minnesota has this elite pass defense, right? They're like 12th in the country in yards per pass attempt, 18th in effective pass or whatever it was. But now that we're into conference play and Minnesota's starting to see some of these Big Ten teams that have quarterbacks, we're maybe seeing that Minnesota's pass defense might not be very good. They've been struggling the last few games. So in my opinion, it's a perfect buy low spot on Luke Altmaier and the Illinois offense against a Minnesota pass defense that I think is in a sell high spot. Do I trust it enough to bet Illinois? I did bet it, but I split my money to protect myself. I took Illinois +3, but I also took the other half of my unit and put it on Illinois team total over 20.5. Basically, that protects me against Max Brosmer going off in case he is the real deal. He hasn't played nearly as well on the road, so I think Illinois is going to cover and possibly win the game, but I felt the safest way to bet Illinois +3, Illinois team total over 20.5. Still like it at 21.5 if you can't find the 20.5. Next game, Ole Miss on the road at Arkansas here. Hogs are catching a full touchdown at home. This number was at 6.5, but according to this data, it looks like a bunch of money came in and bought up the Ole Miss -6.5s. Take that data with a grain of salt. But the total's sitting at 53.5 for this one. So let's get into the matchup, and we'll start with the Ole Miss offense, and I don't know what's going on with this unit. If you look at their numbers on the year, this looks like a top 10 offense. They're 5th in the country in yards per play, 8th in success rate. Look at the passing numbers. 3rd in yards per pass attempt, 6th in success rate per dropback, 9th in effective pass. This offense is sitting at 12th in OFEI. So what's the problem? Well, if you've watched Ole Miss football this year, you know what the problem is. They racked up all of their offensive stats in the first 4 games of the season against bad defenses. Through their first 4 games, they were averaging 55 points per game, almost 9 yards per play. It's crazy. 61.5% success rate. So they were racking up these elite offensive numbers against the likes of an FCS program, Middle Tennessee, Wake Forest, Georgia Southern. In their last 4 games, now that we've gotten into SEC play, this Ole Miss offense doesn't look right. It doesn't look like the Ole Miss offense of last year, and we all keep waiting for it to show up, and we're just not seeing it. In their last 4 games against Kentucky, South Carolina, LSU, and Oklahoma, granted a tough stretch of schedule, but hello, you play in the SEC. It's like it's going to get easier. In those 4 games, they're averaging just 24 points per game. So from 55 points per game to 24 points per game now that we've gotten into SEC play. 38% success rate. 6.06 yards per play is actually still okay, but just a 38% success rate for Ole Miss in their last 4 games. The run game has been non-existent. They are missing Judkins, it looks like, in their last 4 games. In those 4 SEC games, just 120.5 rushing yards per game, 36.3% success rate per rush, 3.39 yards per carry. So they're struggling to run the ball, and they're matched up against an Arkansas defensive front that, let's give them some credit. They've played the run really well this year. They struggled in their first SEC game on the road at Auburn. 146 yards on the ground, 50% success rate per rush, 5.62 yards per carry. So in their first SEC game, Auburn was able to run the ball. But in their last 4 SEC games, just 4.22 yards per carry, 37.6% success rate per rush is solid against LSU, Texas A&M, Tennessee, Mississippi State. I mean, they're a decent offense. Their defense is terrible. So Arkansas's defensive front deserves our respect. They're doing a good job against the run. So this Ole Miss offensive slump that they're in, can we count on it to show up here? I mean, I don't know. Based on what we've seen the last 4 games, maybe this is who Ole Miss is this year. Maybe the offense isn't as good as we expected it to be. But when we look at the matchup on the other side, this is where you can find some value on Ole Miss. Defensively, they are living up to the hype. 3rd in the country in yards per play, 1st in success rate. They're 1st in the country in yards per carry allowed, 4th in success rate per rush, 5th in effective rush. Also great numbers against the pass. So as disappointing as Ole Miss offense has been, defensively, they're playing very well. But you know who else has been playing really well? Taylon Green and the Arkansas Razorback offense. 29th in the country in yards per play, 11th in success rate. Pretty well balanced. They can run the ball. They can throw the ball. They're sitting at 38th in effective rush, 33rd in effective pass. They did whatever they wanted last week. Granted, that was against Mississippi State, who is the worst defense in the SEC, and it's actually not even close. They're the worst defense in the SEC by far, but they put up video game numbers through the air and on the ground against Mississippi State last year. Problem is, probably not going to be able to do anything that resembles that against Ole Miss. On the season, Ole Miss is allowing 2.13 yards per carry, 32% success rate per rush, and against the pass, under 6 yards per pass attempt, 32.6% success rate per dropback. This Ole Miss defense is looking every bit as good as they're supposed to be, maybe even better. I will say, though, in terms of their SEC schedule so far, Kentucky, South Carolina, Oklahoma, those are not good offenses. They played LSU, so LSU, they deserve credit. They lost that game at home. So the only good SEC offense they've seen is LSU. The other three are really bad SEC offenses. You can argue that Arkansas is going to be the second best offense that Ole Miss has seen all season. So as good as the Ole Miss defense has been, they haven't really been tested. And let's not pretend that we didn't see Vandegrift and the Kentucky offense moving the ball. Vandegrift was making throws on this Ole Miss defense. So I don't even know if I believe in the Ole Miss defense anymore. Taylor Green's been great. He might be able to make some plays here. Now, granted, Ole Miss defensive front has been very good. Look at the pass rush. 5th in pass rush grade, 10th in sack rate, 10th in pressure rate. So there's pressure coming for Taylor Green in this one because Arkansas's offensive line hasn't been anything great in terms of pass protection. 103rd in pressure rate, 88th in sack rate. But you know what? Taylor Green and his athleticism, he's done a great job handling pressure. A- in turnover-worthy play rate, so he protects the ball. C+ QB rating, C, yards per pass attempt. Maybe he doesn't make a ton of plays with his arm when he's pressured, but A- pressure to sack rate, A- turnover-worthy play rate. Doesn't take sacks, doesn't turn the ball over. So based on what we've seen this season, based on what we've seen from Taylor Green, how do we not take a full touchdown at home here with Arkansas? Now, it's a bit square. Ole Miss could show up at any second. Maybe the Ole Miss offense we've been expecting to see all year, maybe it shows up for this game. But based on what we've seen this year, this line should not be 7. So I took Arkansas plus 7, but I split my money in half. I also put a half unit on the under at 53.5. Arkansas has been solid defensively. Ole Miss struggling offensively. If Ole Miss shows up and looks like the 2023 Ole Miss offense, I probably lose both of these bets. But based on what we've seen the last 4 games, I like it. Arkansas plus 7, under 53.5 next game. Virginia Tech on the road at Syracuse here. Orange catching 4 points at home. Total sitting at 53.5. Take a look at the pie charts, and according to the data, action's coming in pretty heavily on the Virginia Tech side. Over 80% of the tickets, over 80% of the money coming in on the Hokies. Take this data with a grain of salt, but after seeing what McCord did last week, I think it's safe to assume that this is probably the case here. I would imagine most people are betting Virginia Tech. So let's get into this matchup. We'll start with the Hokie offense. Obviously, as we know, this is an offense that wants to run the ball. 28th in rushing frequency, and they've been pretty good at it. 20th in the country in yards per carry, just 81st in success rate per rush, but they're 19th in effective rush. They're sitting at 39th in OFEI. Passing numbers haven't been quite what they were expecting, but Drones seems to be improving as the season's progressing. On the season, they're 76th in yards per pass attempt, 94th in success rate per dropback, 93rd in effective pass. Matched up against a Syracuse defense that, I mean, it hasn't been very good. They're 98th in yards per play, 95th in success rate. They're struggling to stop the run, struggling to stop the pass. Not really anything that this Syracuse defense is particularly good at. They're not the worst defense in the country, but certainly not a good defense. I will say this Virginia Tech rushing attack, maybe not quite as dominant as the numbers indicate over the last few weeks. Over 202 rushing yards per game, 5.73 yards per carry. Success rate per rush under 40%, which certainly isn't great. That's against Stanford, Boston College, Georgia Tech. Not exactly the gauntlet of tough defenses here, but even these numbers are skewed because they went nuclear in the Boston College game. 368 rushing yards in the game on 9.2 yards per carry, 48.7% success rate per rush. So they went crazy on Boston College. As a whole, this Virginia Tech run game hasn't been that consistent this year. And Syracuse, look, by no means will I sit here and try to tell you Syracuse defense is good, but they have played solid defense against the run. In their last 2 games against NC State and Pitt, allowing just 3.6 yards per carry, 37.6% success rate per rush, 77.5 rushing yards per game. So Syracuse has actually played the run tough. In fact, that last game against Pitt is so deceiving in terms of the Syracuse defense. They actually played well. They allowed 41 points in the game, but most of those were Kyle McCord giving Pittsburgh points. Syracuse allowed just 4.93 yards per play, 38.6% success rate of the game. So Syracuse defense actually played somewhat well against Pitt. Kyle McCord just gave them so many points. So maybe a little bit of a buy low spot on the Syracuse defense against a Virginia Tech offense that might be overvalued. So I don't hate the matchup for Syracuse defensively here. The Virginia Tech run game hasn't been nearly as consistent as the numbers would indicate. But what about the other side? We got the Syracuse offense, and man, I don't know what to make of this unit. On the season, this looks like a good passing attack. 76 in yards per pass attempt, 16th in success rate per dropback, 6th in effective pass. But they're matched up against a Virginia Tech defense that's been very good this year. They've been very good against the run. They've been very good against the pass. This is a pretty solid, well-rounded defense. Kyle McCord's numbers on the year look pretty good. Almost 2,500 yards passing, 7.1 yards per attempt, 19 touchdowns, 11 interceptions. The thing is, I can't unsee what I saw last week on the road at Pittsburgh. 35 of 64. He dropped back to pass 64 times, 321 yards, no touchdowns, 5 picks. 3 of them went for 6. He threw 3 pick sixes. That was what I was saying before. I mean, Syracuse defense actually didn't play bad against Pitt. Kyle McCord was literally scoring touchdowns for Pittsburgh, which makes this game extremely difficult to bet because Virginia Tech, the strength of their defense is the pass rush. One of the best pass rushes in the country. 6th in pressure rate, 8th in sack rate, 11th in pass rush grade. So Kyle McCord is not going to have time to throw. And let's be honest, when it comes to Kyle McCord, it's starting to look a little bit like Ole Miss in terms of racking up elite-looking numbers through the first 4 games against Ohio, Georgia Tech, Stanford, and Holy Cross. In his last 3 games since then against UNLV, NC State, Pitt, 6.2 yards per attempt. So the passing efficiency numbers are coming down. Obviously, threw 5 picks last week. This is a Virginia Tech defense that's played really well against the pass, allowing under 196 passing yards per game, 6.07 yards per attempt, 31.8% success rate per dropback. That's against Stanford, Boston College, Georgia Tech. All 3 of those teams have quarterbacks. So, yeah, as much as I'd like to buy low on Kyle McCord, I just can't do it. But I do think Syracuse is able to give Virginia Tech some problems getting their run game going. So I think the move here would be under. It's sitting at 53.5. I do like the under. I think Virginia Tech's going to be diligent, stick to the run, and I think Syracuse is able to make some stops, keep the clock rolling. Problem is, on the other side, I mean, Kyle McCord's going to be dropping back to pass with the Virginia Tech pass rush. I mean, who's to say Kyle McCord doesn't gift Virginia Tech points here and pushes this one up and over the total? So I like the under 53.5, slight lean on Virginia Tech, but I'll say under 53.5 for this one. Next game. Vanderbilt on the road at Auburn. Auburn's now laying 7.5, it looks like. There are still 7s out there. Total sitting at 48 or 48.5, depending on your sports book. Let's take a look at the pie charts, and according to the data, action seems to be coming in on the Vanderbilt side. 85% of the tickets, over 70% of the money. But as I always say, take this data with a grain of salt. So let's get into this matchup, and in my opinion, this is probably the most difficult game to handicap on the board because the data points are just everywhere with both of these teams, honestly. But we'll start with the Vanderbilt offense. Obviously, we know this is an offense that wants to run the ball. They're 15th in run frequency, 94th in pace, so they also want to control the clock. As far as efficiency, I mean, 98th in the country in yards per carry, 75th in success rate. They are 30th in effective rush based on the fact that they're seeing a lot of SEC defenses, seeing a lot of tough defensive fronts. The passing numbers look great. 17th in yards per pass attempt, 14th in success rate per dropback. They don't drop back to pass very often. But as a whole, this Jerry Kill, Diego Pavia experiment has been successful. Vanderbilt sitting at 42nd in OFEI, which is definitely a lot higher than where we're used to seeing Vanderbilt's offense, that's for sure. They're on the road here at Auburn, and this is going to be a tough matchup. Auburn, always a tough defensive program. This year's no different. 28th in yards per play, 21st in success rate. Pretty solid against the run, pretty solid against the pass. They're sitting at 33rd in DFEI. Now, when we start to take a look at the individual data points for Vanderbilt's offense, I mean, it really gets challenging. If you look at their last 5 games, just 3.74 yards per carry as a team, 40.1% success rate per rush. This is a team that wants to run the ball. These are not good numbers, and you could say, well, Kyle, they played a bunch of SEC defenses. They also struggled to run the ball against Ball State, which good luck trying to figure that one out. And they're up against an Auburn defense that's been playing the run very well. 3.08 yards per carry, but 42.3% success rate per rush. Indicate when you hand it off, short yardage situations or 1st and 10, you need 4 yards. Teams are getting that against them. So kind of tough to get a read there as well. And as far as the Vanderbilt passing attack, I mean, Pavia struggled against Texas, just 5 yards per pass attempt in that game. 43.3% success rate per dropback isn't even bad. Look at the 5 games before that. 8.94 yards per pass attempt, 45.9% success rate per dropback. So they were actually having some success throwing the ball. before the Texas game. And Auburn's defense against the pass, last 2 games, elite. 6 yards per pass attempt, 26.9% success rate per dropback, 213 passing yards allowed per game. Great looking numbers. 2 games before that, not at all. 9.5 yards per pass attempt, 44.2% success rate per dropback. So you see what I mean on this side of the ball. The data points are everywhere. Auburn's got elite numbers against the run, but the success rate isn't great, which is exactly what Vanderbilt does. They don't break a lot of big plays. They're just trying to get those 4 or 5 yards, those 3rd and 1, those short yardage situations. That's what Auburn's bad at. So I don't know on this side of the ball. Let's flip it over to the other side of the ball and take a look at the Vanderbilt defense against the Auburn offense. In terms of FEI ratings, these 2 units are pretty evenly matched. Vanderbilt 94th, Auburn offensively is 80th. Auburn's offense has some solid-looking numbers, though. 28th in yards per carry, 6th in success rate per rush, 33rd in yards per pass attempt, 78th in success rate per pass. Peyton Thorne having a pretty good season. I mean, there was that one bad game against Cal in there that's kind of skewing the numbers. He threw no touchdowns, 4 picks. If you take that game out, he's actually been all right. Just under 1,600 passing yards on the season, 8.5 yards per attempt, 12 touchdowns, 7 picks, an A turnover-worthy play rate. Basically, he had one awful game against Cal. Other than that, he's actually having a pretty good year here at Auburn. That being said, the last 3 games have been a struggle for Peyton Thorne. Just 182.7 passing yards per game, 33.5% success rate per dropback, 6.7 yards per pass attempt. It was against Kentucky, Georgia, and Missouri, though. So now that they're playing a lesser defense in Vanderbilt, can we expect Peyton Thorne to start throwing the ball? I mean, we saw Vanderbilt get cooked by Quinn Ewers in Texas. 288 yards through the air, 45% success rate per dropback, 7.8 yards per attempt. So based on the fact that Peyton Thorne's coming off back-to-back games against 3 elite defenses, now he sees Vanderbilt at home, I think Peyton Thorne should bounce back and play well here. Although that Cal game was at home, he should have been able to throw the ball on Cal through 4 interceptions in that game. So I really don't know there. And in terms of Auburn running the ball, I mean, they went nuts against Kentucky, which doesn't even make sense. 328 rushing yards in the game, almost 7 yards per carry, 55.6% success rate per rush. In the 3 games before that, just 3.59 yards per carry, 41.4% success rate per rush. So this is not a great rushing program. They just went absolutely nuts on Kentucky. And Vanderbilt's defensive front, I mean, they've been okay against the run, 4.13 yards per carry allowed in their last 4 games, 51% success rate per rush. So not a ton of big plays on the ground, but they're having trouble making stops in the short yardage situations or the 4 or 5 yard carry. So I don't know. This is the toughest game to handicap on the board. I think Auburn is more than a touchdown better than Vanderbilt at home. So at 7, I would lay. I kind of wish I grabbed one of the 6.5s. Now that there are 7.5s popping up, it'll be Auburn or pass for me, but I'm not messing with Vanderbilt. This team seems magical. So Auburn or pass, next game. ODU on the road at Appalachian State. App State catching 3 at home or 2.5. Depending on your sportsbook. That's crazy. But I mean, I get it. Old Dominion's been red hot recently. Total sitting at 60 or 60.5, depending on your sportsbook. Let's get into this matchup, and we'll start with the App State defense against the Old Dominion offense. Appalachian State, as I'm sure you know, struggling on the defensive side of the ball. This is one of the worst defenses in the country. 129th in yards per play, 129th in success rate, struggling against the run, struggling against the pass. Now, Old Dominion, not much of a passing attack, but as I'm sure you've heard, if you follow Sunbelt football, since Colton Joseph took over at quarterback, Old Dominion has been moving the ball. On the year, they're 40th in yards per carry, 80th in success rate per rush, 28th in effective rush. In the last 4 games, since Colton Joseph, who's a freshman, by the way, took over at quarterback, they're averaging 32.3 points per game, 45.8% success rate, 6.23 yards per play. Yes, you can point at the fact that they've seen some questionable defenses, but they're playing App State, so it's not like that's changing. But no question, the offensive production for Old Dominion has seen a huge jump since making the quarterback change over to Colton Joseph. In their first 4 games before the quarterback change, they were averaging just 20 points per game, 34.3% success rate. Yards per play down is 4.63. And you can't deny that Appalachian State looks terrible on the defensive side of the ball. In their last 3 games, they're allowing 37.3 points per game, success rate at almost 50%, 6.73 yards per play. So at first glance, it definitely looks like a favorable matchup for Old Dominion, and I don't have anything to disprove that. With Colton Joseph on the field, they should be able to move the chains here, especially on the ground. I will say he's a freshman. Big road game here. It's only a matter of time before the kid makes some mistakes, so be a little careful there. But as a whole, Old Dominion should be able to move the ball in this terrible defense. But on the other side, this is where you can find some value on App State. Obviously, we know it's been a terribly disappointing year. App State offensively was supposed to be this powerhouse coming into the season. They're just 82nd in OFEI, 55th in yards per play, 61st in success rate. We know this is an offense that wants to throw the ball. They don't want to run it. They want to put the ball in the hands of Aguilar. Just 74th in yards per pass attempt, 67th in success rate per dropback, 46th in effective pass. Matched up against the Old Dominion defense that's been pretty good this year. The thing is, Old Dominion, their strength is stopping the run. 36 in yards per carry, 24th in success rate per rush, 46th in effective rush. This Old Dominion defense was very good against the run last year. They brought back a lot of production in the defensive front. So this is a good run defense. In terms of stopping the pass, I'm not nearly as sold on this Old Dominion defense. And we just talked about how App State, they want to throw the ball with Aguilar. Old Dominion does not have a pass rush, just 61st in pressure rate, 77th in sack rate, 125th in pass rush grade. Their strength is staying on the line of scrimmage, stopping the run. They don't have a pass rush. So Aguilar at home should have time to throw here. And I know he's had a bit of a disappointing season, but let's not forget, this was the Sun Belt Player of the Year last year. It's not like Aguilar forgot how to throw the ball. He's got over 2,000 yards, 7.3 yards per attempt, 14 touchdowns, 9 interceptions. Definitely been a bit of a disappointing year, but look at Old Dominion's numbers in their last 3 road games. Like I said, this is a defense that specializes in stopping the run. In their last 3 road games, they're allowing 310 passing yards per game, 9.4 yards per pass attempt, 45.3% success rate per dropback. And Appalachian State, because they got off to that slow start, people forgot that this is such a dangerous offense at home last year. And because the Liberty game got canceled because of the hurricane, they've only played 3 home games so far this year. So the Appalachian State dangerous passing attack at home, no one can go into App State and stop Aguilar in the passing attack. Has that really been disproven this year? They've only played 3 home games. They're averaging 297 passing yards per game in those 3, 42.1% success rate per dropback, almost 9 yards per attempt. So Aguilar has played well in his 3 home games. He had the one bad one against South Alabama, but they've played most of their season on the road. So now back at home, catching points. What was the look-ahead line for this? -3, -3.5. It's moved almost a full touchdown. App State hasn't played many games at home. So at home against an Old Dominion defense that struggles against the pass, App State in offense, all they want to do is throw it. I think they're going to have a big game. I think Aguilar's going to have a big game throwing the ball. I think they win outright. So I bet this one. I took App State +3. Also put some on the money line as well. Next game. The Ducks on the road in the Big House. Michigan catching over 2 touchdowns, +14.5 points at home here. Total sitting down at 44.5. Take a look at the pie charts, and according to the data, action's coming in pretty one-sided here. Over 95% of the tickets on Oregon, over 75% of the money. So no question, according to this data, action seems to be coming in pretty heavily on the Oregon side. Take it with a grain of salt, although based on what we've seen so far, I would imagine that's probably accurate. So let's get into this one, and we'll start with the premier matchup. This is what's going to determine who covers this number. Oregon's offense on the road in the Big House against Michigan's defense. This is going to be their toughest road test by far so far this year. Remember, the Ohio State game was at home in Eugene. Now they're on the road at the Big House in this one. Oregon, as I'm sure you know, one of the best offenses in the country. 5th in yards per play, 6th in success rate, 28th in yards per carry, 11th in success rate per rush, 6th in yards per pass attempt, 5th in success rate per dropback. So yeah, pretty well-rounded, pretty dynamic, dangerous offense here. But Michigan defensively has not been bad at all. 20th in yards per play, 18th in yards per carry, 31st in yards per pass attempt. So will Dillon Gabriel be able to get it going here? Well, on the season, he's got awesome numbers. 2,368 yards, 9.3 yards per attempt, 18 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. Not a ton of big downfield passing. Obviously, as we know, that's not really what Dan Lanning wants to do, but he's been pretty flawless this year as a thrower. In the last 3 games, Oregon's averaging over 309 passing yards per game, 54.9% success rate per dropback, 10.7 yards per pass attempt. I will say Purdue and Illinois, not great Big Ten defenses there. Ohio State is respectable. That one was at home at Eugene, though. That being said, I mean, this Michigan defense didn't look all that great last week against Michigan State. Aiden Childs was able to make some plays. 189 yards passing isn't bad, but 40% success rate per dropback, 8.2 yards per pass attempt. So they certainly didn't shut down Aiden Childs, that's for sure, which leads me to believe that Oregon's going to be able to move the ball here. I'm sure Michigan's pass rush is able to give Dillon Gabriel some problems, but it's hard to doubt this Oregon passing attack. that being said, I think we can sell high a little bit on the Oregon rushing attack. In the last 4 games, 5.13 yards per carry, 52.2% success rate per rush, 182 rushing yards per game. They've been running the ball. Purdue is the worst run defense in the Big Ten. Michigan State, not nearly on Michigan's level in terms of a defensive front. Illinois, not a good defense. Ohio State, that's the respectable one on this list. They've seen some weaker Big Ten defenses. I know Michigan has been getting run on in the last 2 games. 4.38 yards per carry, 51.3% success rate per rush, 175 rushing yards per game. But if you look at Michigan's schedule, 2 of their last 3 games have been on the road, and if you remember, rewind 3 weeks ago before the Washington game, we were looking at this Michigan team a lot differently. I mean, this team is 5-1 at home in the Big House, with the only loss being to Texas. They beat Michigan State and covered last week, even though it didn't look pretty. They beat USC at home. So this Michigan team is a little bit different at home in the Big House, and those 2 road games may be skewing how we look at this Michigan team. This is not a tough out to come into the Big House and lay more than 2 touchdowns. Meanwhile, Oregon's schedule, not saying they haven't been tested, but in terms of their road games, at Purdue, it's a terrible defense. At UCLA, we know the kind of season they're having, although they seem to be turning it around a little bit lately. At Oregon State, and the Beavers are bad this year. So when I say this is Oregon's first real road test, it's their first real road test by a mile. So I wouldn't be surprised if Michigan's able to take the run away from Oregon and force Dylan Gabriel to make plays against that pass rush. Is he capable of making those plays? Yeah, and I'm sure he will make some of them, but don't be surprised if Oregon's offense doesn't look quite as fluent as we're used to seeing here on the road in Michigan. But what about on the other side of the ball? Now we have to talk about the Michigan offense, and this is where the positivity stops. This has been a nightmare this year. Obviously, we know they want to run the ball. 16th in run frequency this year. They've actually been pretty good running the football this year. 44th in yards per carry, 45th in success rate per rush, 15th in effective rush. And that does play into the weakness of Oregon's defense. Check this out. On the season, Oregon just 54th in yards per carry allowed, 66th in success rate per rush. So Oregon has actually had some problems defending the run. They have elite numbers against the pass, but doesn't really do you much good against Michigan. They have no interest in throwing the ball. It looks like Davis Warren is going to be the starter, and we know his season has had its ups and downs, let's say, mostly downs, but last game wasn't bad. Last week against Michigan State, just 146 yards passing, but 7.3 yards per attempt, 55%. Success rate per dropback is very good. So Davis Warren had by far his most successful game as quarterback of Michigan last week against a Michigan State defense that really isn't that bad. Look, by no means am I saying Davis Warren is going to make throws on the Oregon defense. I mean, we have seen the Ducks defense look a little shaky against the pass, specifically the Michigan State game, the Ohio State game. Aiden Childs, Will Howard were both able to make throws on Oregon's defense, but Davis Warren is not on that level. So by no means am I saying Davis Warren is going to make throws on Oregon, but I will say he's coming into this game as the starter with confidence, something probably really hasn't had this year. And keep in mind, this is a Michigan offense that wants to run the ball. That's what they want to do. And actually, this offensive line has done a solid job in creating space. 37th in line yards, 10th in stuff rate, plays directly into the weakness of this Oregon defensive front. They can pressure the passer, but they've actually had trouble staying on the line of scrimmage. 86th in line yards, 90th in stuff rate. Michigan might be able to generate a push here and get the run game going. In their last 4 games, they're averaging just 3.77 yards per carry as a team, but look at the success rate, 45.8%, meaning short yardage situations, 1st and 10 getting those 4 yards, 2nd and 6 getting those 4 yards. They've been successful running the ball, so don't be surprised if Michigan's able to move the chains here, running the ball on Oregon's defense, who, by the way, has been struggling a little bit to stop the run. In their last 2 games against Purdue and Illinois, these are not good rushing offense, not even comparable to Michigan's. They're allowing 4.72 yards per carry, 49%. Success rate per rush, 170 rushing yards per game. I think Michigan's going to be able to run the ball on Oregon. I do, which is why sounds disgusting as I'm saying it. I got to take Michigan here. Plus 14.5 at home. They should be able to keep that Oregon offense on the field, move the chains via the run. I like Michigan to come out and at least play them somewhat tough. So give me Michigan plus 14.5 in this one. Also, if you want to look at the Michigan team total over, it's all the way down at 14.5. You can actually get a plus 105. Michigan team total over 14.5 plus 105. Like I said, I don't believe in this Oregon run defense. I think every other aspect of their team is pretty elite. but they struggle to stop the run, and that's what Michigan wants to do. So I do think they're able to get the ball in the end zone a couple times. So Michigan plus the 14.5, Michigan team total over 14.5 at plus money. Sounds good to me. Next game. Texas Tech on the road at Iowa State. Clones are laying 13.5 points here. Total sitting at 56.5. Let's take a look at the pie charts, and according to the data, action seems to be coming in pretty heavily on Texas Tech. Over 85% of the tickets, over 85% of the money. Take it with a grain of salt. So let's get into this matchup, and we'll start with the Texas Tech offense. As I'm sure you know, this is not new. Texas Tech has been running this offense for years. They throw the ball a lot. They run a fast pace. 4th in pace, 29th in pass frequency. There's a couple problems with that. Number one, well, actually, there's 3 problems with that. Number one, they haven't been doing the best job at it. 90th in yards per pass attempt, 70th in success rate. Offense is 66th in OFEI. Problem number 2, they're on the road at Iowa State, who may be the best pass defense in the country, certainly top 10. 2nd in the country in yards per pass attempt allowed, 45th in success rate per dropback, 1st in effective pass. Problem number 3, Behren Morton probably not playing in this game. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that. He's questionable. He was in a sling last week on the sideline. In case you don't know who that is, that's Texas Tech starting quarterback, over 2,000 yards, 7.1 yards per attempt, 17 touchdowns, 3 interceptions on the season. I don't even know who the backup is. They have a freshman that's seen the field a little bit. Do you really want a freshman making his first career start on the road at Iowa State? Personally, sounds like a nightmare. I don't know for sure if Behren Morton's going to play or not. I will say this line at 13.5 certainly makes me think he's probably not going to play. If you have any information on that, please share it in the comments. And by the way, it's not like Texas Tech's offense was playing their best football before Morton got injured. In their 2 games before the TCU game, just 260 passing yards per game, 6.75 yards per attempt, 38.3% success rate per dropback. Last week against TCU's questionable defense, that was supposed to be the week Texas Tech got back on track offensively. 258 passing yards, 6.8 yards per attempt, 41% success rate per dropback. That's against TCU, who we know has a questionable defense. Although, let's give TCU some credit. Last couple weeks out of nowhere, TCU is playing some solid defense, so maybe we need to start showing TCU's defense a little bit of respect. For most of the season, they were trash, though. Now they're on the road against a defense that's allowing 4.63 yards per pass attempt on the season. Success rate per dropback under 35%. Nobody has been able to throw the ball in Iowa State this year. The way to move the ball in this Iowa State defense is run it. That's the weakness of the Iowa State defense. You got to run the ball. Texas Tech, I mean, not that they have no rushing attack. They're a pass-first offense. They are capable of running it. In their last 3 games, though, just 3.91 yards per carry, 44.5% success rate per rush. So they do have some semblance of a rushing attack, but mostly this is a pass-first offense, and I don't think Texas Tech is equipped to give Iowa State problems here. This should be a terrible spot. If Morton doesn't play, this should be a really bad offensive game for Texas Tech here. But what about on the other side of the ball? What about the Iowa State offense? Well, they've been pretty good this year, pretty balanced. They're 29th in yards per play, 67th in success rate. They started off throwing the ball a lot. They've been running the ball more as of late, but pretty even numbers here. 39th in effective rush, 32nd in effective pass, matched up against a Texas Tech defense that is not having their strongest year. 112th in yards per play, 104th in success rate. Like I said before, they started the season off throwing the ball a lot more. On the first 3 games, just 137.3 rushing yards per game. Look at their last 4 games. Over 222 rushing yards per game, 5.12 yards per carry. So they seem to be running the ball a little bit more as of late. But like I said, they're a pretty balanced offense that's capable of moving the ball in multiple ways. The reason I'm bringing that up is Texas Tech against the run is actually kind of respectable. They had 1 terrible game against Baylor, 255 yards, 7.7 yards per carry. In their other 7 games this year, they actually have respectable numbers against the run, just 4.28 yards per carry, 43% success rate per rush. So maybe Texas Tech is equipped to at least slow down the Iowa State run game. I can see that. It's not like Iowa State's run game is unstoppable. I can see Texas Tech's defense giving the Iowa State run game some problems, but in terms of defending the pass, I mean, in their last 2 games against Baylor and TCU, allowed 309 passing yards per game, over 50% success rate per dropback, 9.7 yards per attempt. So it should be a really favorable spot for Rocco Beck to throw the ball. Really don't have much hope for Texas Tech in this game. And if Behren Morton doesn't play, and in my opinion, I don't think he is, Iowa State should win this one handedly. So it would only be Cyclones minus 13.5 for me here. Not going to bet this one right now in case Behren Morton plays. The line will drop. So Iowa State or pass next. Kansas State on the road at Houston. Houston catching 12.5 or 13. I actually see a 13.5 too. So anywhere in between 12.5 and 13.5 at the time of recording. Total sitting down at 45.5. Let's take a look at the pie charts, and according to the data, action's coming in pretty split on this one. Tickets may be slightly leaning towards Kansas State, money about even 50-50, but as I always say, take this data with a grain of salt. So let's get into this matchup. Last year, Kansas State welcomed Houston to the Big 12 in the form of a beatdown, 41-0. That one was at home, though. This one's on the road. That being said, the way these two teams are trending, not sure if there's going to be a different fate here. Both these teams want to run the ball, and both these teams run slow pace. So right off the bat, before I even look at anything, I'm already leaning towards an under. The question I have is, can Houston make stops against the Kansas State offense? As we know, Kansas State, very good offensive team, 16th in yards per play, 30th in success rate, 12th in PPA, one of the best rushing attacks in the country, 7th in yards per carry, 22nd in success rate per rush, 11th in effective rush. Offense is sitting at 16th in OFEI. Not the most dynamic passing attacks with Avery Johnson. He's got some solid looking numbers on the year. Over 1,600 yards passing, 7.8 yards per attempt, 16 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. But this is an offense that wants to run the ball. They have one of the best RB duos in the country. You take the run away from Kansas State, force Avery Johnson to beat you with his arm. That's how you put this team in a situation they don't want to be in. That being said, not many defenses are able to do it. On the season, they're averaging over 6.4 yards per carry as a team, almost 49% success rate per rush, over 224 rushing yards per game. So is Houston able to slow it down? Well, that's a really good question. It depends on what version of the Houston defense shows up. We've seen such crazy data points from this Houston defense. They're a very talented defense. The team is trash, but not the defense. The offense is terrible. So terrible that a lot of times people overlook and don't realize how good the Houston defense is. That being said, I mean, on the road, week 8 at Kansas, they got lit up. 42 points, over 60% success rate, over 9.2 yards per play. Kansas ran the ball all over Houston. That being said, in weeks 6 and 9, the two games sandwiching the Kansas game against TCU and Utah, defense looked elite. Just 16.5 points per game allowed, 37.6% success rate, under 5 yards allowed per play. One of those games was on the road at TCU, one of the most dangerous passing attacks in the country. As far as making a prediction of what version of the Houston defense we're going to see, I don't know. A lot of variance here. They can look like a top 25 defense. Also, they can get lit up to another planet. I personally like this Houston defense. I like it at home too. So I do think they are able to give Kansas State some problems. That being said, am I willing to put my money on it? It's a different question. Now, on the other side of the ball, we don't even need to have a discussion here. Kansas State's defense has taken such a big step forward this year. This is maybe a top 25 defense, certainly a top 25 defense against the run, maybe even a top 10 run defense. They're 64th in the country in yards per play, 23rd in success rate. Look at their numbers against the run, 22nd, 6th, 4th. Where this Kansas State defense struggles is in the secondary. That's where they're vulnerable. You can throw the ball on Kansas State. That being said, Houston can't throw the ball, period. I guess Chris is going to be the starting quarterback now. Does he really strike fear in you throwing the ball? Houston offensively this year, 105th in yards per play, 118th in success rate. Passing numbers look terrible. And yeah, the Houston run game has looked better as of late. Over 178 yards per game, 4.28 yards per carry. I mean, these numbers aren't good, but way better than what we were seeing for most of the season. That being said, they're not going to be able to run the ball on Kansas State. We saw Kansas State get run on one time all year. It was last week in the rivalry game against Kansas. 5.65 yards per carry, 192 yards rushing in the game. In their other 7 games, their first 7 games before that, they're allowing 2.79 yards per carry as a team. 32% success rate per rush. This is an elite run defense. Houston's not going to be able to run the ball here, and Chris does not scare me enough as a passer to put any faith in the Houston offense. So where does that leave me in terms of placing a bet? Well, I said from the beginning I was leaning towards an under. I think the under is the way to go. I'm a little worried about Kansas State scoring a bunch of points, but I think they're going to stick to the run here. So the clock should be rolling. I don't think Houston's going to contribute many. Give me the under 45.5, maybe a Houston team total under, but I think I'm just going to take the under 45.5 next game. UCLA on the road at Nebraska here. Huskers laying 6.5 points at home. Total sitting down at 39.5. Take a look at the pie charts here, and according to the data, action's coming in heavily on the Nebraska side. Over 85% of the tickets, over 80% of the money coming in on Nebraska. Take it with a grain of salt. So let's get into this matchup, and we'll start with the UCLA offense, who, by the way, seems to have found something. This is a pass-first offense. They're 14th in passing frequency. If you look at their numbers on the year, they don't have a run game at all. They're 133rd in yards per carry on the season, 133rd in success rate per rush. Passing numbers are looking pretty good, and they're actually getting better as we progress through the season. 55th in yards per pass attempt, 62nd in success rate per dropback, 20th in effective pass. They're matched up against a Nebraska defense that's been pretty streaky. I mean, there's been times where it looks really good. There's also been times where it looks pretty terrible. On the season, they're 27th in yards per play. Strong against the run. 10th in yards per carry allowed, just 72nd in success rate per rush, though. 10th in effective rush, 29th in effective pass. Now, if you look at Ethan Garber's numbers on the season, it's not very impressive at all. 1,484 yards, 7.8 yards per attempt, 8 touchdowns, 9 interceptions. Obviously, these look pretty ugly. But the thing is, with this UCLA offense, like I mentioned before, they seem to be coming around. I mean, through 5 games, it was looking like UCLA was about to set a record for worst offense in program history. Through the first 5 games, just 34.9% success rate per dropback, 6.34 yards per attempt. Keep in mind, this is an offense that wants to throw the ball. And through the first 5 games, those were their passing numbers. But look at the numbers from the last 2 games against Minnesota, too. I mean, the other one was against Rutgers, not the best Big Ten defense, but Minnesota is a solid defense. In their last 2 games, 338 passing yards per game, 59.4% success rate per dropback, 9.1 yards per pass attempt. Out of nowhere, Ethan Garbers is slinging the ball all over the field. Now, in this particular matchup, the Nebraska pass rush is definitely a concern. This is probably a top 25 pass rush. They're 14th in pressure rate, 20th in sack rate, 14th in pass rush grade. And if you look at Ethan Garbers' numbers when pressured on the season, you'd be concerned. I mean, there's a definite drop-off in production when he receives pressure. But here's the thing. Most of those numbers are from the first 5 games of the year. If you isolate it to just weeks 7 and 8, his last 2 games, Ethan Garbers, when pressured, 26th in the country in passer rating, 14th in yards per attempt. So in those 2 weeks, week 7 and 8, which are his last 2 games, he's been one of the best quarterbacks in the country under pressure. Now, to be fair, Minnesota and Rutgers don't have a pass rush that's quite as good as Nebraska's, but still, Ethan Garbers has earned my respect. This is looking like a pretty good passing offense here at UCLA, and the Nebraska pass defense actually seems to be trending in the opposite direction. Through the first 6 games, just 6.15 yards per pass attempt allowed, success rate per dropback under 38%, just 188.3 passing yards allowed per game. But in their last 2 games, over 250 yards per game, 11.55 yards per attempt, 62.7% success rate per dropback. Now, you might be looking at this graphic thinking, well, Kyle, that's against Indiana and Ohio State, 2 of the most powerful offenses in the conference, which is a fair point. But remember, earlier in the season in week 4, Illinois was cooking on Nebraska. They came into Nebraska. Luke Altmaier was making plays with his arm. They won that game outright. So although they have some nice-looking numbers against the pass on the season, I'm not so sure how much I trust this Nebraska secondary, and the way Ethan Garbers is playing, I expect UCLA to be able to move the ball in this one. Maybe not up and down the field, but I expect Ethan Garbers to make some throws in this game. But now we flip it over to the other side, and everything I said about the UCLA offense starting off terribly and now looking great, say the opposite about the defense, because through the first 4 or 5 games of the season, UCLA's defense was looking like the strength of the team. Now they can't seem to make stops. 64th in yards per play, 128th in success rate. This defense really struggling against the pass. Now, the good news for UCLA is they're matched up against Nebraska, and this Nebraska offense just seems broken recently. Raiola started off the season looking so good, really hasn't looked as good as of late. On the season, just over 1,700 yards, 7 yards per attempt, 9 touchdowns, 7 interceptions, D-plus big-time throw rate. In the last 3 games, Nebraska's averaging just 183.3 passing yards per game, 30.8% success rate per dropback, 5.2 yards per attempt. By the way, Rutgers is in there. They were struggling to throw the ball on Rutgers, which is a concern because that Rutgers defense is not very good. If you look at the 3 games before that, I mean, Raiola was looking like the man. 9.57 yards per attempt, over a 57% success rate per dropback, 274 yards per game. Raiola was looking like he's on pace to be one of the best quarterbacks in the conference in a year or 2. It's come crashing down in the last few games. Now, the good news for Raiola is this looks like the perfect spot to get back on track at home against a UCLA defense that's been getting cooked through the air in their road games. In their last 3 road games, they're allowing 292 passing yards per game, 53.4% success rate per dropback, 9.17 yards per attempt. Now, you may look at this graphic and say, well, Kyle, that's LSU and Penn State. Yeah, but Rutgers is in there, and Kaliakmanis was piecing UCLA's secondary up. So we can look at Raiola's recent games and be like, oh, we can't trust Dylan Raiola right now. But I'm telling you, I don't think we can trust this UCLA secondary, especially on the road here in Lincoln. So I think this is a perfect spot for Raiola to bounce back. Now, the bad news for Raiola is he's probably not going to have run support here. In their last 3 games, I'm not sure what's going on, but Nebraska just forgot how to run the ball. Just 2.77 yards per carry, 40.5% success rate per rush, 96 rushing yards per game. Early in the season, this was looking like a pretty good rushing attack. Not sure what happened, but they just cannot run the ball anymore. And UCLA defensively, as bad as they've been against the pass in a few of their games, they've actually been somewhat solid against the run, just 3.38 yards per carry allowed on the season, 46% success rate per rush. So I don't hate the matchup for UCLA's run defense, but I do think Raiola is in a good position to have a big game throwing the ball, which is why I like the over here. The market's against me. It's been bet all the way down to 39.5. Not 100% sure why. I think this one's going to go over. I'm going to bet this too. So give me the over at 39.5. Next game. North Carolina on the road in Tallahassee. Florida State catching 2.5 points at home. Total sitting at, looks like 50. I do see a couple 49.5s out there. Take a look at the pie charts, and according to the data, nobody wants to bet the Noles. Over 85% of the tickets on North Carolina, over 95% of the money. So according to this data, action coming in heavily on the North Carolina side. Take this data with a grain of salt, although I think it's probably accurate that no one wants to bet Florida State right now. So let's get into this matchup. North Carolina offensively, obviously a team that's very reliant on the run, very reliant on Hampton getting it going. On the season, they're 57th in yards per carry, 37th in success rate per rush, 33rd in effective rush. Good news for North Carolina is they're matched up against a Florida State defense that's been much stronger against the pass. The strength of this Florida State defense is the pass rush. Against the run, 79th in yards per carry allowed, 77th in success rate, 75th in effective rush. So will North Carolina be able to run the ball on the road at Florida State here? In my opinion, that's the question we need to answer here, because I don't think we can count on Criswell. I know his numbers on the season don't look that bad. 1,662 yards, 7.6 yards per attempt, 10 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. But the truth is, he racked up all of his numbers in 2 games. Last week against Virginia, which was awesome. I had North Carolina money line, so I appreciated it. He had a huge game, 293 yards, 9.8 yards per attempt, 46.7% success rate per dropback. And also the James Madison game. He threw for a shitload of yards in that one as well. So he really racked up all of his stats in 2 games. If you look at the 3 games before the Virginia game, just 6.27 yards per pass attempt, 36.9% success rate per dropback. This has not been a reliable passing attack at all. North Carolina needs to run the ball to be successful here. Not to mention, this Florida State defense seems to be coming around against the pass. Look at their last 3 games. Just 5.27 yards per pass attempt allowed, 37% success rate per dropback. Look at the opponents. Clemson, Miami, Duke with Malik Murphy. So 2 elite passing attacks and 1 pretty decent passing attack, and Florida State's been shutting the pass game down. So I do not expect Criswell to be able to throw the ball in this game at all. So will North Carolina be able to run the ball? It's tough to say. In their last 5 games, the numbers are okay. 4.37 yards per carry, 43.1% success rate per rush, 156.6 rushing yards per game. Florida State defensively against the run, I mean, there's 2 really bad games. They struggled against Clemson and Miami, 5.26 yards per carry, 43.4% success rate per rush. So they struggled to stop the run in these 2 games. But then look at their games against Duke, SMU, and Cal. They actually played the run well. 3.72 yards per carry, 38.3% success rate. So they actually played the run pretty well in these 3 games. It's really just the Clemson and Miami games where they were struggling to stop the run, and Hampton's good, but North Carolina's offense is not on the same level as Miami and Clemson. So I actually think it's going to be tough sledding for the North Carolina offense here on the road in Tallahassee. But what about the other side of the ball? Let's talk about the Florida State offense, which, as I'm sure you've heard, has been a train wreck this year. They're 21st in pass frequency, so they have been throwing the ball. Whether or not that's Mike Norvell wanting to throw the ball, or that's a result of being down on the scoreboard in every single game, I don't know. But so far, they have been throwing the ball a lot. Haven't been particularly good at it. They're 128th in yards per play, 131st in success rate. Rushing numbers look terrible. Passing numbers look terrible. This has been probably the most disappointing offense in college football this year. Now, the good news is they're matched up against a North Carolina defense that's also been struggling on the season. 79th in yards per play allowed, 63rd in success rate. I know you might be looking at these numbers thinking, Kyle, these don't look that bad. Well, recently, we're seeing the run defense fall apart for North Carolina. The front seven's really not playing well, which means Brock Glenn might actually have an opportunity to show us if he's capable of playing quarterback. So far, it hasn't looked good for Brock Glenn. Just 386 yards, 4.7 yards per attempt, 3 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. But the thing is, his 3 starts at Miami, at Duke, and Clemson. So was he really given an opportunity? I mean, there's a lot of quarterbacks, if you throw them in there against those 3 defenses, they're going to have ugly looking numbers. That being said, these are really ugly looking. in his 3 starts, 4.73 yards per attempt, 27.6% success rate per dropback. This is terrible, but I think Brock Glenn is going to have something in this game that we have not seen him have all year. Run support. The Florida State run game might really be coming around here. Through the first 6 games, they were averaging 2.24 yards per carry as a team, 38.2% success rate per rush, under 60 rushing yards per game. It was dreadful. In the last 2 games, Florida State's been running the ball a little bit. 4.34 yards per carry, 147.5 rushing yards per game. That's against Duke and Miami, too. So they've been playing some elite defenses. The run game seems to be coming around a bit. And let's not forget, this North Carolina defense has really been struggling to stop the run. I know they had a great game against Virginia last week, just 0.64 yards per carry, 18 rushing yards allowed in the game. But in the 4 games before that, 230 rushing yards allowed per game, 50% success rate per rush, 5.68 yards per carry allowed. So this North Carolina defensive front has not been good despite having 1 game against Virginia. I think Florida State might be able to run the ball in this game. There's something I haven't said all year, which is why I think the wrong team's favorite here. I think Florida State's the move. It pains me to even think about betting Florida State again, but I think they win this one. I think it's a little bit of a sell high spot on North Carolina after the big win against Virginia. Give me Florida State plus the 2.5 and the money line. I'm sick. Next, Florida on the road at Georgia, or not on the road. I'm sorry. This is in Jacksonville. This is a neutral site. Georgia laying 14.5 points. Total sitting at 52.5. Let's take a look at the pie charts for this one. And according to this data, tickets are coming in pretty split, about 50-50. Just over 60% of the money coming in on Georgia. Take it with a grain of salt. So let's get into this rivalry. Georgia has won 6 of the last 7. Florida's actually 2-2 against the number in the last 4, so they have covered the number a couple times. 3-1 to the over in the last 4 matchups, but we're not interested in the past. Let's talk about this year. The Florida offense, man, sticking around. 29th in yards per play, 17th in success rate. Every time you think this Florida offense is dead and they're just going to punt on Billy Napier, they come out and they continue to play pretty well. The offense is sitting at 26th in OFEI. Passing numbers look great, although a lot of the passing production was Graham Mertz, not Lagway. But still, this offense 13th in the country in yards per pass attempt, 27th in success rate, 18th in effective pass. The problem is they're up against a Georgia defense that seems to be figuring it out. Georgia 35th in yards per play, 17th in success rate. Strong numbers against the run. Numbers against the pass aren't elite looking, but it was really the Alabama game that are skewing the numbers a bit. They played great last week against Texas, and I think most people would agree Texas has one of the best offenses in the country. They held Texas to just 15 points, 3.41 yards per play. 3.41. A lot of people, they see the final score, 30-15. Georgia's offense didn't even play that well in that game. Georgia's defense dominated, 27% success rate. Just an elite performance from the Georgia defense there. DJ Lagway is going to have his hands full in this one. Now, he has been able to make some big plays through the air. Hasn't been the most consistent thrower, but 11.5 yards per pass attempt, so he's made some big plays. 5 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. His stat line last week against Kentucky is crazy, so check this out. 279 passing yards in the game, 18.6 yards per attempt. He only dropped back to pass 14 times. He went 7 of 14, 279 yards with no touchdowns. 0 touchdowns, 1 interception. The weirdest stat line from a quarterback ever. Just 37.5% success rate per dropback, which isn't great. But again, this kid is just a walking big play. But like I mentioned before, this is going to be a tough one for DJ Lagway. We just saw Georgia hold Quinn Ewers and the Texas offense to 4.7 yards per pass attempt, 25.9% success rate per dropback. If they can lock down Quinn Ewers, they can certainly lock down DJ Lagway. Now, one thing DJ Lagway does give you is dual threat. He's a dual threat quarterback. He's an athlete. Last week against Kentucky, who has been a pretty good defense this year, although they're struggling as of late, but Kentucky is a solid defense. 4.48 yards per carry, 197 rushing yards in the game, 54.1% success rate per rush. So this Florida run game might be dangerous with DJ Lagway at quarterback, but in the last 3 games, Georgia seems to be figuring it out defensively. Just 81.7 rushing yards allowed per game, 2.92 yards per carry, 30.3% success rate per rush. So as great as the Florida offense looked in the Kentucky game, I don't have a ton of hope for them here against Georgia. I think this Georgia defense is the real deal. I think it's going to be a struggle for Lagway. But what about on the other side of the ball? What about the Georgia offense? Obviously, as I'm sure you know, Georgia likes to throw the ball with Carson Beck 18th in passing frequency so far this year. They have been pretty good at it. 33rd in yards per pass attempt, 30th in success rate per dropback, 4th in effective pass. Run game hasn't really been there like Georgia's run game has been in years past. In fact, that's 2 years in a row where the Georgia run game has been a little bit disappointing. 71st, 65th, 85th. For the rushing numbers for Georgia. And like I said before, despite what the final score says against Texas, they won 30-15. They put up 30 points. The offense didn't play well. Just 4.13 yards per play, 32.4% success rate is not good. And Carson Beck is not looking like the Heisman Trophy candidate that we thought he'd be this year. Just under 2,000 yards, 7.9 yards per attempt, 15 touchdowns, 8 interceptions. Interceptions are becoming a problem here for Carson Beck. He only threw 4 or 5 all last season. He protected the ball well. I don't know what's happening this season, but all of a sudden he's having interception problems. Look at the passing numbers last week against Texas. 4.3 yards per attempt, 175 yards through the air, 28.6% success rate per dropback is not good at all. It was not a good game for Carson Beck. That being said, the 2 games before that, it did look like he was getting back on track against Auburn, Mississippi State, averaging about 350 passing yards per game, 59.1% success rate per dropback, 8.95 yards per attempt. So it looked like Carson Beck was getting back on track there. But then against Texas, I mean, we saw him putting the ball in harm's way again. I think he threw 2 more interceptions. Now, you might be thinking, well, Kyle, that's Texas. Florida's defense is certainly not Texas. And you'd be right in saying that. But the thing is, don't sleep on this Gators defense. They are playing significantly better. In their first 2 FBS games, they were allowing 10.6 yards per pass attempt, 42.9% success rate per dropback, 281.5 passing yards per game. Look at the numbers in the last 4 games. Just 184.8 passing yards allowed per game, 6.58 yards per pass attempt, 36.1% success rate per dropback. This Florida defense is playing the pass well. That's in their last 4 FBS games. And I honestly don't know if we can count on the Georgia run game being there. Since week 3, Georgia's averaging under 4 yards per carry as a team, 42.3% success rate per rush, 116.6 rushing yards per game. This has not been a good rushing attack, and Florida's defense really hasn't been that bad against the run. 50% success rate per rush isn't good, but 3.66 yards per carry, 159.3 rushing yards per game, that's really not bad. So as far as betting this game, personally, I like the matchup for both defenses. I think 51.5 is a little high. I don't trust the Georgia offense right now. I do trust the defense, and I think Florida's defense is a little undervalued. So I think 51.5, I think you'd have to go under there. The reason I didn't bet it, Kirby Smart has shown us in the past he enjoys running the score up on Florida, so I could see him doing that. So probably not going to bet this one, but it'll be under a pass. Next. Good morning. Recording this one early as shit. Next up, Indiana on the road at Michigan State. Sparty's catching 7.5 points at home. Total sitting at 52.5, pretty much across the board here. Let's take a look at the pie charts, and according to the data, action's coming in heavily on the Indiana side. Over 90% of the tickets, over 85% of the money. Take this data with a grain of salt. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this matchup. I mean, in the last 7 games, Indiana's 7-0 straight up, 7-0 against the number. Not really a train I'm trying to stand in front of. It looks like Curtis Rourke is back, too. He missed last game, the quarterback, Curtis Rourke. It looks like he's going to play in this one. I will say, though, Aiden Childs has earned my respect. Check this out. In the last 4 games, look who he's played. Ohio State, Oregon, Iowa, Michigan. That's his last 4 games, and he's putting up decent numbers throwing the football. 8.35 yards per pass attempt, 42.9% success rate per dropback, 208.8 yards per game. So even though this Indiana defense has been elite, Aiden Childs should be able to make some plays here. I mean, he's been making plays on some of the best defenses in the country. That being said, we can't use the excuse. We can't point at Indiana and be like, you haven't played anybody anymore. We can't do that because they just played Washington with Will Rogers at quarterback. We know that's a respectable offense. Held them to 17 points, under 39% success rate, 5.48 yards per play. So we can't point at Indiana and say you haven't played anybody anymore because they just beat up on Washington. They beat Washington by 2 touchdowns with a backup quarterback. So yeah, I think it's time we finally show Indiana some respect. I personally think this number's crazy inflated. I'm not laying 8 points on the road, but I'm not trying to step in front of Indiana either. So I guess I'll say Indiana or pass for this one. Next game. Arizona on the road at the Bounce House. UCF laying 6 points at home. Total sitting at 55.5 or 56. Let's take a look at the pie charts, and according to the data, action's coming in pretty split on this one. Just over 55% of the tickets. Money's about 50-50. take this data with a grain of salt. So let's get into this matchup, and we'll start with the Arizona offense, which has definitely been a disappointment this year. As we know, this is an offense that wants to throw the ball with Fafita. The problem is they haven't been very good at it this year. On the season, 69th in yards per pass attempt, 88th in success rate. Now, the good news for Arizona here is they're matched up against a UCF defense that's been pretty bad against the pass this year. Their strength has been stopping the run, even though the last few games it seems to be flipped. But yeah, on the season, UCF 78th in yards per pass attempt allowed, 96th in success rate. So maybe Fafita is able to put together a good game here. That would be back-to-back good games for Fafita. On the season, his numbers are pretty disappointing. 65 yards, 7.1 yards per attempt, 11 touchdowns, 10 interceptions. But like I said, he is coming off a good game. Last week against West Virginia, 308 yards through the air, 50% success rate per dropback, 9.1 yards per pass attempt. Pretty much his first good game since the opener. In the previous 6 games before last week, just 6.47 yards per pass attempt, 38.5% success rate per dropback. So Fafita had been really struggling going into that West Virginia game. Had a great game against West Virginia. Now, you might be thinking West Virginia's secondary is terrible, Kyle, and you're right, but you know what? You might be able to say the same thing about UCF. They've been bad for most of this year. Last week against BYU, 9.5 yards per pass attempt allowed, 44.4% success rate per dropback. Like I said, this UCF secondary has been pretty bad for most of this year. There's a couple decent games in there, but for the most part, you've been able to throw on UCF. So maybe Fafita is able to string together 2 back-to-back good games, something we haven't seen all year. Now, as far as the UCF run defense, I know you can look at the last 2 games against Iowa State and BYU, 5.32 yards per carry, 255.5 rushing yards allowed per game. But the thing is, UCF's been pretty good against the run this year. This is just 2 games against Iowa State and BYU. Arizona doesn't have much of a rushing attack. I mean, in the last 4 games, 3.51 yards per carry, 36.2% success rate per rush. So even though UCF has gotten run on in the last 2 weeks, don't really expect Arizona to be able to run the ball. But I don't trust that UCF secondary at all. I think Fafita might be able to throw the ball in this game. I haven't put my faith in Fafita much this year, but I do think this is a decent spot for him. On the other side of the ball, we got the UCF offense, and we don't even know what's going on here with the UCF offense. We don't even know who's playing quarterback this week, but we know this is a rushing offense all the way. One of the best rushing offenses in the country. 9th in yards per carry, 4th in success rate per rush, 6th in effective rush. Matched up against an Arizona defense that, I mean, it hasn't been good, but it's been way better than years past. It's probably the best Arizona defense we've seen in some years. 79th in yards per play, 83rd in success rate. I mean, average numbers against the run, average numbers against the pass for Arizona. Like I said, we really don't know what to expect here from UCF offensively. For the first 5 games, it was KJ Jefferson playing quarterback, 8.9 yards per attempt, but as a whole, it wasn't a very efficient passing attack at all. He got benched. Then we saw Ja'Cory Brown for a few games. The passing numbers were terrible, but actually the rushing numbers looked pretty good when Ja'Cory Brown was in there. But then he actually got benched last week. So as of right now, we don't know who's playing quarterback this week. If they've announced it and I haven't seen it, drop it in the comments. As of right now, I don't know who's playing quarterback for Central Florida. Part of me wants to say I don't care because we know UCF just wants to run the ball, especially at home in the bounce house. No one can stop that rushing attack. But as far as the quarterback position, I really don't know who's going to play. But like I said, last 2 games, they're averaging 7.87 yards per carry, 47.6% success rate per rush, over 267 rushing yards per game. So part of me is like, who cares who's playing? Who cares who's playing quarterback? They're just going to run the ball. Obviously, the quarterback position is important. That was more of a joke, but seriously, this team just wants to run the ball. As far as Arizona's defense against the run, it's tough to know what to expect here. In their last 3 games, they're allowing over 5.1 yards per carry, which obviously isn't good, but 39% success rate per rush actually is pretty good. So they've allowed a few big runs here that are skewing the numbers, and it's not like we haven't seen this Arizona defensive front look really good this year. Week 5, we saw them go on the road into Utah and shut that run game down. Just 2.9 yards per carry in that game, 38% success rate per rush. So this Arizona defensive front, it's not great, but it's really not bad. I wouldn't be surprised if they're able to give UCF some sort of problems and keep them from averaging 7.5 yards per carry like they've been doing. Where Arizona's been really struggling is stopping the pass. In the last 3 games, they're allowing over 50% success rate per dropback, 8 yards per pass attempt. But like I said, we don't even know who's playing quarterback for UCF. They don't have a passing attack at all. I mean, well, I don't think they're going to put KJ Jefferson back in there, who would probably be their best option in terms of a passer. So the fact that Arizona's struggling against the pass doesn't worry me at all against UCF. which is why I think I'm going to take the 6.5 here. I think Arizona might be able to keep this close, maybe even win outright. So I'm on Arizona plus 6.5. I think it's a good spot. I think it's a good spot for Fifita and McMillan to get it going. So Arizona plus 6.5 here. Next game, Arizona State on the road at Oklahoma State. Pokes are now catching 3.5. This number was at 3. Up at 3.5 now. Total sitting at 56.5 pretty much across the board. Take a look at the pie charts, and according to the data, action seems to be coming in slightly on the Oklahoma State side. Just over 55% of the tickets, just over 55% of the money. Take this data with a grain of salt. So let's get into this matchup, and straight up, this might be a tough one for Oklahoma State. This is an Arizona State offense that wants to run the ball. They want to give the ball to Scattaboo, and this is an Oklahoma State defense that's really bad, especially against the run. Oklahoma State defensively, 134th. That's dead last in the country in yards per carry allowed, 100th in success rate, 84th in effective rush. Arizona State's rushing attack, when it's working, it's tough. 31st in yards per carry, 5th in success rate per rush. How is Oklahoma State going to get off the field defensively in this game? They're 13th in effective rush. Not to mention, this Arizona State run game seems to be heating up. In their last 3 games against Kansas, Utah, and Cincinnati, 3 defenses that are all much better than Oklahoma State. They're averaging over 226 rushing yards per game, 5.57 yards per carry, over 58%. Success rate per rush is crazy. So this Arizona State run game seems to be heating up, and Oklahoma State against the run. I mean, Oklahoma State against anything. Check this out. In their last 4 games, they're allowing 39 points per game, almost a 50% success rate, over 8.2 yards per play. Want to know how they've done specifically against the run in those games? Check this out. Over 322. These aren't passing numbers. Those are rushing. In the last 4 games, Oklahoma State is allowing over 322 rushing yards per game, 7.49 yards per carry, over a 4-game sample size, 52.1% success rate per rush. This looked like one of the worst run defenses in the country. Now, to be fair to Oklahoma State, Kansas State, elite rushing attack. West Virginia, probably top 25 rushing attack. BYU, probably top 15 team in the country. Baylor, okay, Baylor's a little bit unexcusable. They're not that great this year, but they played a tough schedule. But still, I mean, this team can't tackle. They're getting blown off the line of scrimmage. Arizona State's a terrible matchup for Oklahoma State defensively. And here's what makes it even worse for Oklahoma State. Even if they load the box up, right? Let's say they throw 8 in the box and they make it their sole mission to take Scattaboo out of the game. They're still in trouble because Oklahoma State's strength defensively is the pass rush. That's how they stop the pass. As they pressure the passer, they're actually not bad at it. Sam Leavitt's strength as a quarterback is escapability. I mean, he's great at getting away from pressure. Look at his numbers when pressured. They're actually better. He's been excellent this year at escaping pressure, getting outside the pocket, and making throws. So even Sam Leavitt is a tough matchup for Oklahoma State. And by the way, Sam Leavitt's going to play in this game. He missed last game. I'm reading he's fine, and he's going to play in this one. So even Sam Leavitt is a tough matchup for Oklahoma State. And check this out, it gets worse. Oklahoma State runs a lot of man coverage, 11th most in the country. Sam Leavitt happens to have excellent numbers throwing the ball in man coverage. This is just a bad matchup for Oklahoma State's defense across the board here. So the question becomes, can Oklahoma State's offense keep up? And personally, I think the answer is no. Oklahoma State's offense hasn't been nearly as disappointing as the defense has. Actually, they have some nice-looking passing numbers on the year. 46th in yards per pass attempt, 50th in success rate per dropback, 13th in effective pass. And that does play into the weakness of the Arizona State defense. Really tough to run the ball on Arizona State, but you can definitely make throws on Arizona State. We've seen that secondary struggle. So actually, offensively, maybe not the worst matchup here against Arizona State. We can pretty much hang our hats on the fact that the run's not going to be there for Oklahoma State. Arizona State on the season is allowing 3.66 yards per carry, 39% success rate per rush. And as I'm sure you've heard, Ollie Gordon hasn't been able to get it going all year. Just 3.73 yards per carry on the season for Oklahoma State, 38.4% success rate per rush. So the run's probably not going to be there for Oklahoma State. Like I said before, if you want to move the ball in this Arizona State defense, you have to throw it. Their numbers against the pass in the last 3 games, I mean, they're not terrible. 225 passing yards allowed per game, 43.8% success rate per dropback, 6.87 yards per pass attempt. So they're not getting cooked through the air, but that is the vulnerability of the Arizona State defense. If you want to move it on Arizona State, you got to throw it. And you know what? Bowman's going to have time to throw because Arizona State's pass rush has not been good this year. 117th in pressure rate, 83rd in sack rate, 126th in pass rush grade. So Bowman's going to have time to throw here. It just comes down to if you trust Alan Bowman to make the throws, which is a crazy question because there's definitely been times this year where he's been making plays. There's also been times this year where he looks absolutely terrible. Personally, I don't trust Bowman not to make mistakes. If the run's not going to be there for Oklahoma State, which it's probably not, there's no way I can take them to stay within 3.5. So it's got to be Arizona State for me here. I feel like the whole world might be on Arizona State, but according to the pie charts, action's coming in the Oklahoma State side. That's why I say take this data with a grain of salt. I don't know who's jumping at the opportunity to bet Oklahoma State here. So Arizona State minus 3.5 next game. USC on the road in Washington. Washington catching, it looks like 2s are showing up. Last night it was 2.5. Looks like it's down to 2. Total sitting at 55.5. Take a look at the pie charts, and according to the data, 85% of the tickets coming in on USC, but the money is closer to 50-50, would be indicative of sharp action on Washington. But as I always say, take this data with a grain of salt. So let's get into this matchup, and we'll start with the USC offense. Now, this graphic is a little misleading. It says USC is 4th in passing frequency, which they are, but they've been switching recently. They've actually been running the ball as of late. If you look at their numbers on the year, I mean, look at their rushing numbers. 16th in the country in yards per carry, 9th in success rate per rush, just 72nd in effective rush, because for most of the season, they weren't running the ball much. They actually are now. So this is not an accurate representation of what USC's offense is right now, but still, we know this is a very good offense with Miller Moss. They're 20th in the country in yards per play, 12th in OFVI, and USC is going to need that run game to be there in this one because Washington's been very strong against the pass. They're actually, on paper, one of the best pass defenses in the country. 3rd in yards per pass attempt allowed, 2nd in success rate per dropback, 5th in effective pass. Their numbers against the run a lot more vulnerable. So the new look USC offense might be a tough matchup for Washington here. Miller Moss numbers on the year don't look bad. 2,200 yards, 7.2 yards per attempt, 16 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. And you know what? He did have a big game last week against Rutgers. 308 yards, 11 yards per attempt, 61.5% success rate per dropback. So he had a good game last week against Rutgers. But if you look at the previous 6 games before Rutgers, I mean, just 6.32 yards per pass attempt. So for the most part, those big downfield passing plays just haven't been there for Miller Moss. And remember, they're up against a Washington defense that's been elite against the pass this year. Just 5.08 yards per pass attempt allowed, 32.2% success rate per dropback. They haven't gotten thrown on all year. So USC needs this to continue, and check this out. In the last 4 games, USC is averaging over 5.8 yards per carry, 52% success rate per rush. This has been a very good, very efficient rushing attack, and that plays directly into the weakness of the Washington defense. They actually did a decent job last week against Indiana. They lost by 2 touchdowns, but 45.1% success rate per rush, not very good. 3.62 yards per carry, obviously that's good, but look at the 3 games before that. Over 192 rushing yards allowed per game, 5.4 yards per carry, 49.1% success rate per rush. So this is not a great run defense, and you got USC coming in. They've been running the ball really well. I expect USC to hand the ball off here and be able to run the ball in Washington. Do I expect Miller Moss to go off on the Washington defense here on the road? Probably not, but I do expect USC to be able to keep the chains moving via the run game. But what about on the other side? Let's talk about the Washington offense. 30th in pass frequency so far this year. This is an offense that wants to throw the ball with Will Rogers. Numbers look great. 20th in yards per play on the season, 10th at success rate. Passing numbers, I mean, this is most likely a top 25 passing attack. I think most would agree. 20th in yards per pass attempt, 8th in success rate per dropback, 26th in effective pass, which matches up well with USC's defense. They've struggled against the pass this year. 57th in yards per pass attempt, 109th in success rate per dropback is not good for USC. Although USC's defense has been better than last year, but they've been struggling a little bit against the pass. Here's the thing with Washington's defense that worries me. They seem to be trending in the wrong direction here. Through the first 6 games, they were averaging about 300 passing yards per game, 52.6% success rate per dropback, 9.18 yards per attempt. Will Rogers was looking like the man. Jed Fish was looking like a genius. But in their last 2 games, we're seeing them come back down to earth. Just 6.4 yards per pass attempt, 41.3% success rate per dropback. That's not great for an offense that wants to throw the ball. Just 234 passing yards per game. And I mentioned before how USC's been struggling a little bit against the pass this year. But actually in the last 2 games, the numbers look pretty good. 343 passing yards per game. But that's only because their opponents drop back a million times. Just 7 yards per pass attempt. Allowed 42.2% success rate per dropback in their last 2 games. That's really not bad. In the 2 games before that, it looks bad against Minnesota and Penn State. I mean, 9 yards per attempt, 56.4% success rate per dropback. But I guess if you're on USC here, you like that they're coming into this game off back-to-back games where they played pretty solid defense against the pass. So I actually might like this matchup for USC's defense a little bit because we know Washington's probably not going to have run support. They ran the ball all over Rutgers in Piscataway in Week 5, 207 yards, 7.1 yards per carry. But Rutgers' defensive front is terrible. Everybody's running the ball on Rutgers. In their last 3 games, Washington's averaging just just 3.72 yards per carry, 39.3% success rate per rush. So this is not a great rushing attack, and USC's been playing pretty decent defense against the run. Just 3.56 yards per carry allowed in their last 4 games, 45% success rate per rush. That's actually not good. USC's played a pretty tough schedule, though. I don't know if we can count on the run game being there for Washington. In my opinion, it comes down to Will Rogers against this USC pass defense, and I like that USC seems to be playing better defense against the pass the last couple games. So personally, I think USC is going to win this one. At 2, it has to be USC. I expect them to use the run game to keep the chains moving, as long as it's under a field goal. USC, -2. Next game. Wisconsin on the road at Kinnick here. Iowa laying 3 points at home. Total sitting at 40.5 pretty much across the board here. Let's take a look at the pie charts, and according to the data, everyone seems to be betting the Hawkeyes in this one. Over 75% of the tickets, over 70% of the money. Take this data with a grain of salt. So let's get into this matchup. Head-to-head history, Iowa's taken 3 of the last 4. They've also covered 3 of the last 4. In fact, the last time Wisconsin won here at Kinnick was 2018. So it's been a while since Wisconsin won a football game here. So are they able to break that streak here this season? Well, the good news for Wisconsin is this Iowa defense is definitely not the Iowa defenses of years past. I mean, they're a good defense. They're still a top 25 defense, but we're used to Iowa being in the top 5 defensively. That's just not the case this year. They're 45th in yards per play, 70th in success rate. Look at their run defense numbers. 34th in yards per carry, 90th in success rate per rush. So teams handing the ball off are able to convert in short yardage situations. They're able to get the 4 or 5 yards they want when they hand it off. And that's just not the Iowa defense we've come to know over the last few years. So like I said, this Iowa defense, not the Iowa defense of years past. It's still a very good defense. Not trying to say they're bad, just not quite as elite as we're used to. The question is Wisconsin the offense that's able to take advantage of that? Personally, I'm not really sure about that. They're 60th in yards per play, 51st in success rate. Their rushing numbers look pretty good. 44th in yards per carry, 33rd in success rate per rush, 43rd in effective rush. Braden Locke as a passer, not really sold on. I mean, it's been pretty clear. If he has time to throw in the pocket, he can make the throws. If he's pressured at all, it's going to be a long day for Braden Locke. That's what we've kind of been seeing from Braden Locke so far. On the year, he's got 1,281 yards, 7.2 yards per attempt, 7 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. These are certainly not very impressive numbers. Granted, I mean, he's played some very tough defenses in there. The thing is, he's kind of racked up a lot of his numbers in the games against bad defenses. For example, the Rutgers game, the Purdue game, racked up a lot of his stats in those 2 games. Against the tougher defenses, he hasn't been very effective at all. But the good news for Braden Locke here is Wisconsin's offensive line has been excellent in pass protection so far this year. 7th in pressure rate, 43rd in sack rate, 6th in pass blocking grade. And Iowa defensively, not an elite pass rush. I mean, it's good. 45th in pressure rate, 42nd in sack rate, 20th in pass rush grade. But Iowa's pass rush is certainly not Penn State's. How about that? That's the best way to phrase it. And I mentioned before, I mean, that's the key for Braden Locke. If you give him a clean pocket to throw from, he can make the throws. But if he's pressured in any way, it's going to be a nightmare. So maybe Wisconsin's able to give him time to throw here in this game against Iowa. And as far as the run game goes for Wisconsin, I mean, obviously on the road at Kinnick, it's a tough place to go run the football. That being said, Wisconsin's been able to run the ball a little bit in their last 2 games. That was against Northwestern and Penn State. So 2 very, very tough run defenses. In fact, Penn State's probably the best run defense in the country. The 2 games before that, they were running the ball all over Rutgers and Purdue. Granted, those are bad run defenses, 6.2 yards per carry, almost 270 rushing yards per game. What I'm saying is this Wisconsin run game is starting to look like the Wisconsin run games before Fickle got there with Jonathan Taylor, these type of Wisconsin run games. And Iowa, like I said, not quite the elite defense we're used to seeing. So I can't believe I'm saying this. I kind of like Wisconsin to move the ball a little bit in this game. I think the run game's going to be there to an extent. I think Braden Locke will have some clean pockets to throw from. I think Wisconsin might be able to move the ball in this game. The problem for Wisconsin comes on the other side of the ball because this Iowa run game is some serious shit with Caleb Johnson. They're 14th in run frequency this year. They've been excellent at it. 9th in yards per carry, 62nd in success rate per rush. So maybe not as consistent as they'd like to see, but they're breaking big runs left and right. They're 10th in effective rush, matched up against a Wisconsin defense that's struggling to stop the run. 84th in the country in yards per carry, 67th in success rate. They've got great numbers against the pass, Wisconsin. Iowa has no interest in throwing it with McNamara. This is a run-first offense all the way, and the only team we've seen that's been able to stop Iowa from running the ball was Ohio State in Columbus back in Week 6. In all their other games, 5.83 yards per carry, 46.8% success rate per rush, over 222 rushing yards per game. So Iowa's going to be able to run the ball on Wisconsin. Here are their numbers from their 3 road games against USC, Rutgers, Northwestern. They're allowing 4.43 yards per carry, 39% success rate per rush, 152 rush yards per game. None of those 3 rushing attacks are as good as Iowa's. So, yeah, Iowa's going to be able to run the ball in this game. But is that enough to lay 3 points here, especially when I think Wisconsin's going to be able to move the football? Answer is no. I can't lay 3 here. I'm also not going to take 3 because I don't think Wisconsin's going to have an answer to Caleb Johnson. I think it goes over the total. 40.5 is kind of low. This is not the Iowa team of years past. I mean, they're going over the total. This is not the 14-13 final score Iowa Hawkeyes defense that we've seen. I think this gets up and over 40.5. Give me the over next game.
Unfortunately, I ran out of time. There was a few more games I wanted to get to, but we'll talk about them on the live show, 10 a.m. Eastern time up to kickoff. We'll go through as many games as we can. I think we have 28 lined up. So if you're able to make it, we'd love to see you in the comments. If you want to just go see what my top bets are and the bet reports that I post, just head over to KyleKirms.com and click on Open Bets. I'll post it there late Friday night. So by the time you're watching this, it'll probably be up. Go check it out. If you're interested, let's have ourselves a great college football Saturday. I need a good one here. I need to go 4 consecutive winning weeks. I'm down right now because of the midweek games. So hopefully I have a big Saturday to make it 4 consecutive winning weeks. Please remember to bet responsibly. Talk to you in the Discord.